Hey guys, so I'm going to talk about the War Powers Clause today, and specifically looking at the militia, the role of the militia, and the role of Congress in war making or war waging. This is something that I've been really curious about, something that I don't feel as well read or well educated about myself, so I wanted to do a lot of research. I've done some research, so what I'm going to go through today with this blog post is what I found so far, but there's more I want to dig into because I know there's a lot of debates about this specific power, and I'm really, even from what I've researched, I'm really just giving you kind of the tip of the iceberg. I can't give you the full amount of what I found because that would just be too much in one blog post. So just kind of bear with me. A lot of these posts that I'm going to be going through today and in the future posts are going to be very educational, kind of academic posts, looking a lot at the Constitution itself and the interpretations of the Constitution, or I guess I should say the intents of the Constitution over time. I shouldn't even say over time, the intents of the Constitution at the time that it was written, so that we can better grasp the way that our government was created to function, and therefore better grasp the way our government is functioning in opposition to the way it was originally set or created to function. So with that, I'm going to start reading this blog post. I'll give a little commentary, but I think a lot of it sort of speaks for itself. So this is called The Constitution for Dummies, War Powers, and the Militia. It's really about time that we start digging a bit deeper into the powers listed in Article 1, Section 8. I don't necessarily mean digging into the case law and precedent of each enumerated power, which we can get to eventually, but rather digging into the thoughts and intentions of the framers when they wrote the enumerated powers. This is really important to me because I think we can get so caught up on the actual case law and the interpretations of the Constitution over time and miss what it was originally written to mean. We really need to grasp that before we start looking at the perversion of that, right? Or the ways that it has been applied or updated over time, okay? So I'm going to start with the War Powers Clause because it's the clause that I needed most help with in my own studies. So I figure I'll share with you what I've discovered. The clause. This is what the clause says. To declare war, Congress, this is in Article 1, Section 8, so this is Congress's power, all right? To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures of land and water. Now, there's some details about what marque and reprisal means, as well as rules concerning captures of land and water. I don't get into that in this blog post, but I can in future blog posts. I just sort of want to touch on the major points first. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, to provide for the organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. That's a mouthful. I know that's a lot to go through. So there's a lot to this section of Article 1, Section 8, and honestly, there's more to the Constitution to deal with that deals with war powers, but I'm only going to focus on Article 1, Section 8, which deals with Congress's power regarding war. And there's more even than Article 1, Section 8, but we're looking at this specifically in this blog post. Since war powers and our understanding of the militia are such inherently critical powers, we must, as government's employers, understand what the powers entail and what they mean. My initial confusion with the War Powers Clause centered around the Militia Clause. What is a militia in contrast with an army and navy? The militia is obviously something that has stayed relevant since the Second Amendment refers to an armed militia being protected. However, I discovered that there was much more nuance to the declaration of war as much as the creation of the Army and Navy than I'd originally thought. Okay, so the debate and a standing army. One of the greatest debates of the Constitutional Convention centered around the war powers of the new federal government. Naturally so. Who's to declare war? Furthermore, what does declare mean? And actually, there was an argument about using the word declare or make. And they had originally said Congress has the power to make war, and they changed it to declare. This is how sort of nitpicky they were with even the specific words used in the Constitution. So, who funds the war? Should there be a standing army and navy to protect the country from foreign invasion? Or should the federal government rely on the state militias and state funding, much like they did in the War for Independence? These, along with many other questions, plagued our founders while writing the Constitution. Ultimately, the framers decided that they would be the first to make the unprecedented decision to give Congress the sole and exclusive responsibility of taking the country from a state of peace to a state of war. This was unprecedented because almost all European countries gave this power exclusively to the executive. However, the founders, particularly Madison, were very wary of so much power in the hands of one individual and wanted to prevent any irrational emotional moves by the executive to quickly take the nation into war. So this was a really big point of contention. I don't know if point of contention is the right way of putting it, but this was a debate, and it was rather unprecedented to give the power of war making to the legislative body rather than the executive, because in almost all historical context, it's given to the executive, since the executive is usually the one waging the war, and the executive can make decisions quickly. But that's kind of what they wanted to avoid. They didn't want decisions to be made quickly. They wanted decisions, especially decisions like war making or declaring war, to be left to the body that was very slow and cumbersome. So basically, give the power to declare war to the slowest, most cumbersome branch in order to prevent any unhealthy or irrational moves of war making. They didn't want the country to become engaged in military or personal conquest, nor to have a proclivity towards war. Further, the framers believed that wars tended towards centralization of power. Therefore, it should not be entered into often or quickly. The slowest branch, as well as the branch most directly connected to the people, was therefore bequeathed with the power to take the country from peace into war. Of course, there's much that I could unpack about what war is, what is a full-fledged war versus a strategic military move, but we're not going to get into that in this blog post. Since Congress was given the power to take the country into war, it was also given the exclusive power of funding and creating the military needed to wage that war. This was also hotly contested because many of the founders had a bitter taste in their mouth from the experience with the British Standing Army, naturally. Being well-read, the framers were also aware of the historical examples of other countries whose standing armies were used for oppression and conquest. They associated standing armies with tyranny and proclivity towards war. And I'm getting a lot of this from a professor named Waxman, Matthew Waxman, and I'll reference him in a little bit down further. This was something they were heavily wary of and were therefore particularly careful when drafting this power. However, Washington, Hamilton, and those who had experienced fighting in the War for Independence felt that there needed to be some kind of provision allowing for a standing army, because obviously there is the chance that foreign invasion could happen, and liberty is also in danger if the country cannot defend itself. If you notice, the enumerated power given to Congress regarding armies says that Congress can make law to raise, by law create, and support, by law fund standing armies, but that the appropriations of funds for the standing army expires after 2 years. This was a very intentional caveat to the power of the standing army. On one hand, the army is able to exist in times of peace. So the enumerated power does not specify that Congress must only create and support an army if there is a war to be fought. The army can exist regardless of whether or not the country is engaged in waging war. And that's a really important point to realize, is it doesn't say Congress can create an army and fund an army if there is a war being fought. It says, no, Congress can create an army, essentially, for whatever reason, as long as they want. However, because the framers were particularly wary of armies and the government's proclivity to use standing armies to repress their own citizens, the founders worked in a kill switch for the standing army. Congress is constitutionally required to revisit the funding of the standing army every 2 years and can simply stop the flow of funds if they believe such an action to be necessary, crippling the standing army in such a case. Such a caveat is not part of the Navy clause because the founders were less concerned about the use of the Navy to repress citizens and were also aware that building a strong Navy would take a substantial amount of time. The framers thought through, argued over, and theoretically justified every little aspect of our government's job description. The militia. This brings us to the militia clause. Historically speaking, militias predated the Constitution and the government. Every colony turned state had their own militia, and these militias were to be constitutionally guaranteed, in fact. Dr. Matthew Waxman of Columbia Law School argues that he believes the Constitution would not have been ratified if not for the militia clause. This is how fervently the states held to their militia. So the militias were incredibly important. They were considered sort of one of the key building blocks of the American Republic because they were the state military, and they were not a standing military. It was made up of men who just were trained to fight should the need arise. In other words, Waxman argues that while militias are constitutionally protected and guaranteed, a standing military is not. So a standing army is a discretionary power, one that Congress can choose to use or not use. A militia has to exist. A militia is a constitutionally protected power. Not so with state militias. Prior to the new government, almost every able-bodied man within each state was given some sort of military training. This means that in a time of war, every able-bodied man was both armed and trained to fight in that war, though war making was not his primary vocation. The clauses related to the power of Congress to call forth the militia are very specific. So notice the words. The militia can only be called forth to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. In short, the militia can be used if there is a domestic need. However, the training and appointment of these state militia officers is reserved to the states. Further, Congress cannot call upon the state militias to fight foreign wars, but can call upon them if there is a specific domestic need, such as an insurrection or an invasion on the mainland. So think about it in terms of if there's something that has to be dealt with domestically, the people who are not just a standing military are going to be the ones that are going to be called forth. At least that's part of the idea. I'll address the arguments surrounding what a militia is today in subsequent articles, but I believe I've given you enough to chew on for now. Conclusion. I laid out the framers' original understanding and intent regarding the war powers cited in Article 1, Section 8. What I have not done is explore just how greatly perverted these powers have become over time, but before we can see the perversion from the original, we must understand and know the original. This is our job as Americans. This is our job as government's employer, and it is really a job that we've neglected for far too long. So I've just laid the foundation here. This is just the start, the building block. There's so much more to unpack here, but hopefully this is kind of whetting your appetite to want to learn more about this war powers clause, the war powers of our federal government in general, and what the militia actually is.